everybody. This is Pastor Brady Henderson from the First Baptist Church of Gaston, and you are listening to the Menorah Podcast. The Menorah Podcast is a podcast ministry of the First Baptist Church of Gaston that seeks to share the light, send the light, and speak the light of Jesus Christ all across the airways of the internet. And hard to believe, but we are here today in the studio recording episode 50. And so today is Thursday, February the 6th, and if you were with us last week, my co-host and I, Alan, we discussed a little bit, kind of a summary of my pastoral anniversary that I'll celebrate on February the 21st of this month. So if you have not watched that, or listen to that episode, I encourage you to pause this one, go back, listen to that one, and then come back and pick up here. So it'll make more sense once we kind of get rolling here. So if you listened last week, then you know that last week we overviewed the first 4 years. I shared about a little bit of my own personal growth and a little bit of that. So we're going to talk about 2021, and Alan's got a few things that he'll ask me and that we'll talk about here. And so, Alan, I'm going to kind of give it to you, and anything in 2021, which is kind of hard for me to remember. I need to roll back there for a second, but anything in 2021 is fair game.
Well, first of all, you'll find that that's going to happen more and more.
I'm pretty scared of that.
Particularly as you get more and more in your mind.
Well, I thought you were going to say more gray hairs I get, so I appreciate that.
Well, that kind of goes along with it,
you know. All right, well, that's not good. Okay.
Birthdays are a terminal illness.
Gotcha.
But anyway, I think we left off last week's episode with a question that we were going to kind of start with today, and that was in your book, as you look at our congregation, how have you seen us mature and grow in that first year?
Yes, that was a great question. So I did get a little bit of time to think about that and to kind of meditate on that a little bit. So I'll be honest with you, the congregation has obviously, everybody can see with the eye that we've grown numerically. So I won't really speak to that. I want to talk a little bit more about internal growth as far as discipleship, as far as leadership, leaps and bounds. If I had to just use 3 words, leaps and bounds, I would say when I came in, I'll say this, I would say 95% of congregations cannot handle my personality. And I do not mean that against them. That's kind of more of a knock against me. But it's a lot of bluntness, and it's a lot of, I know God has given me certain gifts, and I know that God has called me here for a certain reason, and my job is come in here and lead. And if you don't like it, then you don't need to be a part of it. And a lot of people don't like that, okay?
Right.
And I understand that, but if you look at the New Testament, a lot of people wouldn't have liked the Apostle Paul because he led that way. Mm-hmm. Most people wouldn't have liked Peter because when he was planting New Testament churches, he led that way. And nobody definitely in the American church today would have liked Jesus because that's how he led. And so I try to model my pastoral leadership, and I've tried to do this since day one, obviously after the biblical qualifications in 1 Timothy and Titus, but also after the examples that Paul, Jesus, Peter, Timothy, all of those New Testament leaders, the way that they led the church is how I tried to lead it. In other words, when I came in, I made it clear to this congregation, and it took quite a while for this mindset to get out of some people's heads, is that I am not your puppet. Like, I do what God tells me to do, and I have to lead according to that. And I don't lead because, you know, you got this certain program you want to push, or you got this certain kind of music, or whatever the case is, right? For me, that was a big deal. So to answer your question, yes, we've grown a lot in that area. The church has fully adapted to my leadership, I would say. You know, there's always a few people that want to go rogue every now and then, but that's every church, that's everything. But I would say for the most part, the congregation, you know, and I would like to hear it from a congregant's viewpoint, but when you call a 21-year-old, it would be impossible to think, oh, well, we can tell him what to do, or we can do this, or we can do that. And I know for me personally, and I don't say it in a cocky way, but if you're my age and you're going to into a church with 90% of the people older than you, really higher than that, 95% of the people older than you have to have that air about you and that sense about you to where I'm confident that God has called me, because if I'm not, I'm going to get eaten alive. And it's going to be bad for them, it's going to be bad for me. And I remember that's one thing that Joe Youngblood told me when I came here. He said, "You either going to eat or you're going to be eaten. You get to decide based on your leadership." And that doesn't mean I eat people and I'm mean to people. It doesn't mean that at all. It just means that I'm confident in what God has placed me to do here. In other words, I'm not going to get run off. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, it makes sense to me, and I think one thing that comes to mind is when you are secure in your relationship with the Lord and what exactly you're supposed to do, what you've been called to do, it's pretty easy to be that way. You know, I know when I do things or when I participate in something, I don't necessarily, I'm not necessarily the smartest person to do that, but I know if God's called me to that, that I have more of a confidence in
Yeah.
He is going to deliver what He's asked me to do.
Yeah, and so I kind of think, and I'm a historian, and I've studied up and down at the pastors of the past and all that, and I really think the number one thing, the way the congregation has grown, in my viewpoint, is we have completely done a 180, and we are 100%, in my opinion, pastor led. And for whatever reason, in the past, that wasn't always the case. It wasn't always congregation's fault. Sometimes it was pastor's fault. Sometimes the pastors of the past didn't want to lead. They just didn't want to. And that's hard, right? I do think a pastor does need to be a born leader. And that looks different ways with different men. But to just sit in the office and just want to preach, well, that's great. I love to sit in the office and study, and I love to preach, but I am the under shepherd, and that just doesn't mean visiting. That means leading, and leading gets messy. And I learned that very early on, that I was not going to be everybody's best friend, and that I wasn't going to make everybody happy. But once we started really changing the tide, especially in 21, and I will say this, one of the best in 2021, Dwayne Johnson became chairman of deacons, and Dwayne. So, and Hayward did too. Hayward was the chairman deacon before him. Both those guys in 2021 completely supported me. And I think the church was ready. The church had got the pastor before me, the church had got a small taste of what real leadership looked like. And like a candy bar, they got halfway down the candy bar, and then the candy bar got thrown away because God called him elsewhere, which is fine, and we respect that 100%. And so I came in, and of course everybody's going to be apprehensive, because how is a 21-year-old going to lead us? How does that work, right? And at the time, most of the people in the church had children older than me. So how are we going to do this? And the leaders of the church that were here when I got here 100% fully got behind me. And then over time, everybody else followed. And so 2021 was really the foundation. 27 people joined the church. 12 people were baptized. That doesn't seem like a lot to many people, but at that time in our church, that was a really big deal. Yeah, so I've seen the church grow completely in there, because when I first got here and I started to lead, I could tell some people had never been led by the pastor, either because they didn't let themselves be led or the pastor didn't try to lead them, whatever reason. And so that was a learning curve. And there was a lot of not love, hate, but there was a lot of growing pains in that. I would go in and say, I think we need to change this. Well, why are you telling me to change this? I've been doing it this way for X amount of years. Well, I think God's revealed to me that if we're going to really fulfill the Great Commission, we need to change this. And, that was met with some resistance. But I think over time, I think, a lot of people on the outside looking in that weren't in our church were like, okay, 21-year-old, they're going to run him off within a year. It's not going to work. I will never forget, we had a volunteer in this hallway right down here in 2023 pull me to the side and said, I just want you to know that I thought you were going to be gone within 8 months. but you proved me wrong, and you proved church wrong, and not just that, but I trust you, and I have never seen somebody, this is what a person said in this church, I have never seen a pastor come in here, tell people what to do, and they do it. And this person said, that's why I'm willing to follow you.
Well, I think a lot of times people, God has called you, or God has called any pastor for a specific purpose. And he, much like a recent message that you preached, he doesn't need Gaston First Baptist Church to fulfill his mission.
That's right.
We as church members should always desire that we are part of his mission.
Yep.
And we should always desire personally and individually to be part of that mission.
Yep.
And part of that mission is to follow the person that he has chosen for us.
And that's really hard. That's why a lot of pastors don't stay long. Because in the first few years, you have to do some really hard stuff. And one thing that was hard here is that the longest serving pastor served here 11 years. So this church was pretty used to a guy being around 4 or 5 years or 3 years and then gone. All the way back to the 60s, it was like that. And way before then. So, I saw that coming in, and I did not view Gaston First as a stepping stone. I did not view it as, I'm going to preach here a few years, I'm going to go somewhere else. Now, there was a time here where I asked the Lord to take me out of here because it was rough. There was a lot of stuff I had to go through. That was part of laying the foundation. But anything God calls you to do is not always going to be easy, and I kind of knew that. And, I don't really know what my purpose here is. But if I had to take a guess, and I could be wrong here, I see my ministry here being a lot like Moses's was, of leading them out of Egypt and into a new era. That's how I view it. I'm not going to be the guy that is going to get to see all the fruits of the labor, because a lot of the labor that I've put in, I have tried to impact the next generation 40 years from now when I come back, if I ever get invited to come back, and be able to see what God has done and realize that I had, in other words, I don't have the Joshua role. Okay, I don't have the role of getting able to see. I don't have the opportunity of somebody else taking them out of Egypt and me dealing with them in the desert and then taking them into a new area. I kind of had I think God gave me the purpose of coming in and taking us out of Egypt in a sense. And what I mean is like that mindset and taking us out of that. And we're not in the promised land yet, but leading us through that time to get ready for what God's going to do. I think that's more of my purpose. And when I think of Moses was not the most popular, and I'm not the most popular. If you were to ask the Israelites how many people loved Moses, a lot of them would say they couldn't stand him. Okay, Some of them would say that about me, and that's fine, because I know when people say that, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. Because you're not, and Jesus was the same way. Jesus was the exact same way. There was a lot of people that didn't like the way he did things. And I think you got to be careful. I don't ever want to be I've heard the phrase before, cotton candy preacher. I don't want to be that. I don't want to be that in the pulpit. I don't want to be that in leadership, because cotton candy is going to lead to destruction because it's got so much sugar. And it tastes great. But 10 years from now, it's not going to be great. And so while the taste might be bitter sometimes now, and the changes have to be made now, 10 years from now, I hope we'll be a lot stronger. And that's kind of what I think 2021 was for me. It was a hard year. I had moved away. I'd never lived away before. I wasn't the most loved person in the world when I first came, right? There was some hard things. I had to make a lot of hard decisions. And other than Sherelle, and then Margie was serving in an interim role, I had no staff other than Sherelle and Margie. And so that was tough. That was tough. And just at that time, I was starting to train the deacons to try to start visiting and doing that. But there wasn't a lot of that in the beginning. So that was difficult too. Not to mention all the funerals that came all the time, it seemed like. So, yeah, any questions you have on 21?
Well, I think one thing that to go back kind of what you said earlier about the staff supporting you, the deacon supporting you, I think that shows the importance of unity.
Yeah.
In any organization, but I think it's so much more important in a church.
Oh, yeah.
Church reaches a lot of people, and very often we as church members, we as Christians, we interact with those people during horrible times in their lives.
Oh, yeah.
And particularly in the case of funerals.
Mm-hmm.
That's the worst day of their lives, and those few minutes that you might minister to them make a lot of difference in their lives.
Oh, yeah.
And one thing I think is important to note is we have seen that growth in that year, and moving somewhere and leaving everything that you know and everything that you're comfortable with
Mm-hmm.
is terribly difficult in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
But to go into a situation where you had the benefit of seeing the vote, and you knew how many of the people were behind you.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that probably was not reflected in that vote was the number of people that were not here for the vote.
Yeah, yeah.
Due to COVID concerns. So,
and some of them never came back.
And some of them never came back.
Yeah.
And that's one thing, I agree, again, in a recent message where you said that COVID was one of God's ways of purging the church.
Yeah, cleaning the church up.
Yep.
Yeah. So 2021 was good. We saw a lot of awesome things. Really, that 2021 class, I hate to call it that, but the new members class started in 2021. A lot of those, if not all of those, that graduated that first class and joined in 21 are now actively serving in a lot of different ways. So you're starting to see that. That's huge.
I think that's very important because it number one, it gives people a sense of responsibility.
Yep.
It gives them a sense of belonging.
Oh, yeah.
You and I see each other, I would say, 3 days out of 5, at least.
Yeah, more like 4 out of 5, but yeah, that's about right.
Probably fairly consistently. So consequently, just by the fact of proximity, you probably know a little more of what goes on into my life than, say, the people that I see every Sunday, every Wednesday, and maybe a few other times, just because we're available.
That's right.
And I always feel like that I have that support.
Yep.
It's not necessarily because you're the pastor, but just because we have that access to each other.
Time,
I guess.
yeah, time.
And I think that's very important. So often when people get in crisis, they tend to pull away.
Yep.
Whether it is something that's going on in your life medically, whether it's something going on in your life financially, whether it's something going on spiritually, you tend to want to pull into yourself and try to fix it.
Yep.
Whereas what you really should be doing is going to those people that you know love you and that are in your Sunday school class and say, look, guys, I'm struggling.
Yep.
I need help.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I agree. So any questions you have for me on 21 before we close it out?
I think that's about it for 21.
All right. Well, thank y'all for tuning in, and I don't mean any of that offensively. That's just a little bit into 2021 and all that went on then. So thank you so much for tuning in to episode 50 of the Menorah Podcast, and we look forward to seeing you next week. We're going to do part 3 of this as we talk about 2022. So thank you so much.